So who's
Okay.
Which rabbi?
Ishtaduf Ruba Devaga. Okay. So we've been talking about what happens if there's a terrible disaster and you don't get a yield as a farmer. Can you deduct it from your rent that you're paying the landowner, either in cash or in crops? And then we had a bunch of questions. You remember it ended in Teku. So now one of the possibilities is that you're only allowed to deduct from your rent if it's a regional disaster. So it's happening to everybody, then you get to deduct from your rent. Otherwise, the implication is it's your fault as the farmer, so you don't deduct anything from your rent. And one way you can figure out if it's a regional disaster is that if it's the majority of that area. They call it the majority of the valley. People plant in valleys. So if the majority of that valley is stricken, that means that it's a regional disaster, an act of God, we call it today, and something that isn't the farmer's fault. It's something that just happened everywhere. But what happens is, for Ishtaduf Ruba Devaga, right? So at least the majority of the valley was stricken by a blast or some kind of drought or something that ruins the crops. The Ishtaduf Nami Hanachshare. So therefore, of course, this guy's barley crop was ruined. He was supposed to plant wheat, but he planted barley. All right, so what do you do? Remember that's the question is he didn't follow instructions. He said he was going to plant wheat, he planted barley. At the same time, there was this terrible crop destruction, which wouldn't matter whether it was wheat or barley, because they're very similar crops. And this whole thing doesn't work unless they yield a similar amount of money, of cash. So it doesn't matter to the landowner ultimately, because he just wants the cash, or the cash value. All right, anyway. Okay, so can the tenant say that, well, if I planted wheat like you wanted me to, the same thing would have happened, so I'm going to deduct it from my rent. And there's no way you could call this my fault, just because I planted the wrong thing, and I'm going to deduct it from my rent. Or can we say, Ilu zarate chite, have mekayem v'tigzar v'omer v'yakamla. So this is where we ended last time. Or can the owner say to him, the landowner say to him, if you had planted wheat like we contracted for, then my prayers would have been answered. Just because there's a verse in the Torah that says, this is it, v'tigzar v'omer, you pray for something, v'yakamlach, it will happen to you. It will happen for you. Okay? So the argument, in fact, the landowner is making is, I understand that this disaster would have happened whether it was wheat or barley, because it happened to the whole valley. But the thing is, every day I would get up in the morning, and I would put on tefillin, and I would pray to God to send wheat. But you weren't planting wheat. You were planting barley. So you didn't give a chance for my prayer to be answered. Now the question is that a reasonable argument? Are we allowed to take that as an argument? Now, you can laugh at it, but there's two added elements. One is, of course, it's a society that believes in the efficacy of prayer to some extent. I'm going to give some examples in a second, but it's certainly a culture, a society that believes in the efficacy of prayer. And so that's important. What's also important is, of course, who broke the contract. I mean, it was the sharecropper that broke the contract, and this may also be a way of saying that we're going to honor the contract, even if there's a sort of theological objection to the fact that he planted wheat instead of barley. The fact is that he didn't honor the contract, so we're going to rule against them. We'll keep on going in a second. Yeah.
This implies that God cares whether.
Absolutely, sure.
Right.
It does.
And
well, no. It's not that God.
To swallow.
It's not that God cares whether he planted wheat or barley. It's that the guy was praying for wheat. So whatever the mechanism might be.
And it comes back to the same thing. That you prayed for the wrong thing,
yeah.
So therefore I'm not going to.
Right. That's right.
No, but you were you were making it impossible for my prayer to be fulfilled.
That's exactly right.
Well
stated.
For a successful crop, period.
Okay, but he happened to put in wheat, and that's the argument he's making. So I'll throw in a few things too, because this issue of, this issue. Remember, it's just. They're just throwing it out as hypothesis, although it ends up being a powerful argument for interesting reasons. But in a couple of weeks, it's going to be Pesach, right? And we're going to stop praying for rain. So, I mean, right now in our prayers we say Mashiv HaRuach and we're going to Gashem. God who makes Mashiv HaRuach, makes the wind blow and brings down the rain. And in come Pesach we're going to stop. So why are we stopping come Pesach?
That's the rule.
That's the rule. What's the rule? Why is that the rule? There's actually some rules we don't know the reason for, but we know the reason for that. Why do you stop praying for rain in the spring?
Because afterwards you destroy the crops.
Because it doesn't rain anymore, right? Yeah, that's why. So the thing is, are you?
You shouldn't pray in vain.
Is it your rain? Well, yeah. So you shouldn't pray in vain. In other words, what they're suggesting is the possibility that we'll pray for rain and it won't work because it doesn't rain then. And what does that do to our theology, our sense of God? So that's a very interesting. If you think about it, it's a very interesting sort of probing of the theology behind, does God answer prayers? You don't pray for something that's not going to happen. You don't. So and if that's the case, then you don't buy into this cause and effect theology. I'll pray for something and it will happen. In fact, you're acknowledging that, well, we'll pray for that and it won't happen. And then that'll just mess up all of our thinking about God, all of our theology. So it's not as simple as they believe that you pray for something and it could work. They actually would say, no, don't pray for something that you know is not going to happen. I'm going to complicate it with just one more element, is that the phrase Mashiv Haruach Umorid Hagashem is not actually a request. It's a statement. It's you are the God who makes the wind blow and the rain come. And there's an interesting discussion in the Talmud. Is that actually a prayer for rain? Because one rabbi actually brings it up. It actually goes back to, when do we start praying for rain again? So we stop at the end of Pesach. Sukkot. Okay, so there's a discussion about whether you should start on the first day or the last day. So one rabbi says the first day. And the argument back is that, well, if we start praying for rain on the first day, what's going to happen?
We'll be wet.
We want to be outside. You might as well wait till the end before you start praying for rain. So that's we don't want it to rain during Sukkot. We need it to wait at least 8 days so we can be outside in the sukkah. So the rabbi says back, well, wait a second. We're not actually praying for rain. It's Mashiv Haruach Umorid Hagashem, which is a statement of fact and not a prayer. So Mashiv Haruach Umorid Hagashem means God causes the wind to blow and the rain to fall. It doesn't say, please God, make the wind blow and the rain fall. It's just a statement. And the rabbi goes back and says, I'm not talking about lish'ol. So lish'ol is a request, a petition. I am talking about maskir. Maskir means I mention that God does that. I mention that power of God. So he's really saying, actually, we're never really praying for rain. That rabbi turns around the theology. You think we're praying for rain, but we're not praying for rain at all. For him, the spiritual act really is acknowledging that God is the source of power and being thankful for that, standing in awe of that. It's not asking for something. Whereas the other rabbi who says it's lish'ol, which means you're asking for something, is much more, no, God cares about my crops, my wheat and my barley. And when I ask for when I ask for stuff, God listens. So you actually have 2 points of view. It seems like almost a silly discussion, but it's 2 very different points of view about your relationship with God. God is the one that listens to me specifically and directly and cares about my field, or God is the force in the universe that creates these things, and I'm grateful and I acknowledge it, and it makes me filled with a sense of awe. But I'm not suggesting that God will answer my prayers in that mechanistic way. Yeah.
It's an interesting lesson also in setting attainable goals for oneself.
Yeah, right.
So
right.
if you're constantly, longing for something that you never can reach, if you're wasting your time. Just look at what's available, what your resources are, and how you can reach those goals. Right.
Yeah. And this comes up a lot, and there's discussions about how much you're allowed to pray for healing for a person that is not going to recover. So there's a lot of interesting discussions. I'm not going to bring it all up right now. It did come up, if you remember, when the Lubavitcher Rebbe was very old on life support, and there was discussions about how much praying they should really do, given the fact that he was going to die, and people knew that he was going to die soon, and there was a lot of denial in that community that he would actually ever die. Still is some denial that that he's not really dead, or that he's going to come back to life, and you still have elements of that. But that discussion came up. Should we still be praying for recovery when we know there's not going to be a recovery? Should we be praying for rain when we know it's not going to rain? Yeah. Imelda.
This reminds me of that class I took with you, the aspects of God. One of them is God that is cause and effect.
Right.
So, and the other one is God the merciful. So that merciful God might care about us, but the other one doesn't care. It's just the way it is.
Yeah, so what we did in that class is that we combined both. We didn't say it's either or. The God that's Lish'ol, that answers petitions, or the God that we just acknowledge and fills us with awe. We say there's both. We have both elements in God. We have the one that fills us with awe, that's distant and removed and cause and effect, and we also have the God that really does care about my wheat crop. So in this argument, bringing it to here, the owner of the field is saying, I prayed, I had a direct, intimate relationship with God asking for wheat. And God obviously was misunderstanding the whole time, didn't realize that you were planting barley. So that's the theology of the farmer, or the theology of the rabbis who are bringing this argument. We're not done with the discussion yet. So, we'll have two more and then we'll go on. 1, 2, Martha.
But there's also the possibility that if you're making this statement at this particular time of year that God makes the wind blow and the rain come, and you're saying it publicly, you are kind of reminding God, hey God, you're the one who has the power to do this.
Yes, no, you're right. I mean, that's the third way of reading it, and that's really true. The third way of reading that statement is that, yes, it's a statement. It's a maskir.
Right.
So it's a statement. However, the statement is the polite way of asking.
Correct.
Why should we give God orders? So we don't phrase it as a command, God, bring rain. We phrase it as, in a very polite way, you are the God that brings rain, understanding that, in fact, we're asking for rain.
Right.
It's a hint.
Yeah. It's how we phrase lots of prayers. It's how we phrase, like the Misha Berach, you are the God that brings healing. One thing you should ask ourselves, too, before we scoff at this poor landowner that says, I was praying for wheat, the Misha Berach at Saturday services is a very popular time where we are praying directly for an outcome from God, which isn't really that much different than this farmer was praying for an outcome also. And are we expecting an outcome? I think, right. So it's
But part of it isn't, give strength to the people who, and wisdom to the people who are taking care of the person who is ill, give strength to the person who is ill to deal with the consequences of his illness. So it's not.
Well, it depends.
It is heal him too, but.
And it depends on the person who's saying it. I think there's a variety of opinions of the people that are standing up and saying those prayers. But I'm sure there are at least some people that really expect an outcome, that really feel like I'm asking for wheat. Yeah. Okay, last.
I was just going to say, regarding personality traits or prayer in general, I mean, the wheat and the barley makes me think that perhaps general prayer is what helps, and specific prayer is...
Yes,
exactly.
Yeah.
I guess it's tossed out the window.
Well, nothing is tossed out the window.
It's the owner's fault for being so specific. It could have been more general.
There's not like an official theology of prayer.
I understand.
Different personalities bring different prayers, and different personalities bring, different sensibilities to their praying. And I think Judaism incorporates all of them.
And prayer works?
Some people think it does, some people doesn't. You're asking me? It depends. I'd have to shoot back 5,000 questions. What do you mean by works? What? I'd say 100. I would say 100% it works, but what does works mean? That was and I would bore you with lectures about what it might mean. By that time, we'd all be sick. Yeah. All right. Next. All right, so page 180, number 5. Mistabra de amarle. Okay, so now the Talmud says mistabra. Mistabra is a technical term in the Talmud, which means we are ruling on this issue with the tool of svara. Svara means reason. So they're not, in other words, appealing to a precedent, like a rabbi that had ruled on it. Right, hasbir, right, to explain. We're relying on explanation. We're also not relying on a rule of exegesis from the Torah. It's just a mistabra, with the logic would dictate. Now, when they say logic, it's not necessarily logical to you and I, but it is. But for them, it's just the force of logic compels this response. De marle izrat achite havi mekayem b'v'digzar omer v'yakam lach va'al dorachecha naga or. And so they said mistabra then is the logical is that when the guy said, you messed up my prayers, I was praying for wheat, then you messed up the possibility that my prayer would be answered, which is the fulfillment of that verse that I will pray for something and it will be fulfilled for me and light will shine on me. And that's the answer. So that's why in that particular case, if the guy plants barley instead of wheat, he's not allowed to deduct it from his rent, even if there's a makat medina, which means a regional disaster. Now, we could say that there's a theological reason for that because it messed up the guy's prayers, but lurking beneath this is the fact that he broke the contract. So let's keep going because now it sort of analyzes it from the point of view of the farmer. So let's keep reading. Nishtadvu kol stotav shel machkir, ve'ishtaduf nami ha bahadayu. Okay, so the fields of all the landowner. Let's say the landowner has a bunch of fields, lots of fields. Okay, and they all were messed up. By a blight or by weather or something like that too. So he's got a variety of tenant farmers that are working for him in all of his fields. It doesn't say that they are contiguous, these fields, not necessarily next to each other, but they're all over the place. The landowner and they were all affected by it. The ishtaduf nami bahadaihu, and then this particular one, and then you have a one tenant farmer. Okay, so we've got this landowner's got a bunch of fields. And all of his fields are affected. Also, now we're dealing with this one tenant farmer. Velo ishtaduf ruba devaga mai. But it's an interesting thing. But you didn't have the disaster happening in the majority of the valley. It happened in every one of this landowner's fields, coincidentally. But it didn't happen in the majority of the valley. So now in fact, most of that valley wasn't affected. So now the tenant farmer, right, who's the renter, is going to go to the landowner and say, I want to deduct it from my rent, this loss. And of course the landowner is going to say, what do you mean you can't deduct it from your rent? You only deduct it if it's a makat medina, which means it's a regional disaster, and your region didn't have the disaster. It's just the field that you're in charge of. And then his argument back is going to be, well, wait a second, every one of your fields was affected. The field that you have in Jerusalem, the one in Tel Aviv, the one in Haifa, the one in Baghdad. So let's keep reading. Mi amrinan, kevan de lo ishtaduf ruba devaga lo menakele. So do we say, look, it didn't affect the majority of that area, so he can't deduct it from his rent? O dilma, is it possible? Kevan de ishtaduf kulhe arate, because all of this guys, the landowner's fields, were affected. Matzi amarle, the renter can now say, the sharecropper can say, Hai mishum latach didachu. It was because of your bad luck. Seinfeld explains the word lata, which means luck. Just let me finish it. I can tell you're very upset, but sometimes I get the impression you think that I'm just making this up on the spot. I'm reading it, so your anger would be better directed toward the text itself. Yeah, okay, good. I'm glad. I know exactly. All right. Hi mishum latach didachu. It's because of your bad luck, because all of your fields were affected. So you can't blame me for it. If all of your fields were affected. So here's just before I take questions, it's not 100% clear what the word luck is there. Luck could be, and it seems to be implied. In fact, I'm actually just using Steinsaltz's definition of luck. I'm not sure that's what it means. Because you'll see from the context, it's not just luck, but a kind of judgment. Like God is giving you a message. That's more. That sounds as we go on. You'll see that's more what the sharecropper is telling the landowner. There's something going on here up there, in the world, up in the godly world. That's giving you a message by all of your fields being affected. And so for you to blame me doesn't make any sense. So therefore, I'm deducting it from my rent.
That was my argument, which is that obviously, this landowner has a problem in his relationship with God.
Yeah, that's right.
Why should the renter have to pay for the landowner's
Yeah, so you'll see that's essentially what he's saying. So let's now. Okay, so that's the question is, and we'll keep reading. By the way, there's no secondary issue here, or even primary issue of somebody breaking a contract. There is what's lurking behind this is the original law. Is that a makat medina, a regional disaster, is one where the majority of the area is affected, and you don't have that here. So the rabbis understand that that's the law. That they're wondering if the fact that this guy's poor luck overturns their original definition of a makat medina, and therefore can the sharecropper deduct from his rent anyway, even though it's not a regional disaster? Because it's clearly not a regional disaster. With that's a given. Okay, page 181. Mistabra. Okay, so we have a mistabra again. They're ruling from logic. De amarle. And they're ruling now here, I believe, on behalf of the landowner. Imishum lata didi. If this had been my misfortune, let's say, coming from God, because that's what it seems to be. Have mishtayer li porta. Some of my crops would have been spared. Dichtiv, because there's something from the Bible. Kinish arnu ma'at meharbe, which I'm just translating that verse from the Bible. A little bit was saved from the great multitude. The theology behind this is that when God punishes, God never punishes completely. So if God's going to punish you by taking your money, God's going to leave you some money. In fact, how are you going to know it's God that's doing it and not just bad luck? Because there is bad luck. There's such a thing as bad luck, or you're making bad decisions, whatever. How do you know it's the hand of God? This is a theology. I can't prove this to you, but this is a theology. How do you know it's the hand of God? Something is left. That something that's left is like God's calling card. It's like God leaving his card and saying, this is because of me. So you should know. This is because of you displeased me in some way. And that's a long theological discussion you have in the Talmud. Think of the book of Job, where Job is actually left with something. You know, where his friends come and say, that's the proof that God's doing it for you. And then you have it a couple times in prophets, where God never punishes fully and completely. The nice way of looking at that is that God is leaving you always a chance to rebuild if you do tshuva. Okay.
You think Job would agree with that?
No, I don't. Well, Job rejected. That's the whole point of Job. Job rejects the whole premise.
No, the thing is that he left nothing but Job.
Well, he did leave something. He
ultimately, but not during the calling cards.
Job's a complicated issue.
Auschwitz falls in that category. You could argue.
Well, there were yes. I mean, there were religious Jews at the time that said that they would call the survivors Sherita Pleta. Sherita Pleta means, the surviving remnant that prove that, first of all, this is God's judgment, but also that it's a possibility of rebuilding. So this is just transferring that idea to a very
tragic situation.
Well, this isn't such a tragic situation. This is just the prosaic, farmer, and the farmer could say back. I want to point out that in this weird argument the farmer's making. So the farmer's basically saying, if this was God, something would have been left. And that becomes a winning argument. Coincidentally, that winning argument follows the halakha. Because the fact is, it wasn't a makat medina. So you don't overrule the halakha of it being a regional disaster. And now the Talmud puts into the mouth of the landowner a reason why you wouldn't overrule it, which is for us is a theological reason. But you're left with what is actually a very sensible rule. The sensible rule is, how do you decide if it's a regional disaster? More than half the farms are affected. Can you overturn that if the landowner, all of his fields are affected, but they're not all in the same region? The answer ends up being no. Now, there's a peculiar reason why the answer is no. And they could have just said, no, we're going to stick to the law. But they just respond to what seems to be this particular landowner's extreme bad luck. But really what they're saying is, no, we're not going to call that extreme bad luck from the hand of God. We're going to go back to our original definition of a regional disaster. And that's what we're left with. Just like the rabbis venture into theology. It's interesting. They venture into theology with when there's a dispute over the contract, where the guy planted barley and he said he was going to plant wheat. They venture into the theology of prayer, which is an interesting discussion, but they end up ruling that you have to keep to the contract. So they end up, even though they take diversions into theological discussions, they end up with very sensible rules, maintaining definitions and contracts. That's interesting too. Okay, we'll end with that.